caso vamos a continuar con nuestro segundo panel. Este es un panel de contexto que está
Recording in
titulado
progress.
De la crisis de deuda y desarrollo hacia una reforma sistémica, perspectivas regionales y globales. En este panel lo que queremos hacer es discutir desde diversas perspectivas los posicionamientos, las experiencias, lecciones aprendidas sobre el sistema actual de la deuda, así como las asimetrías de juego entre norte y sur, y también plantear propuestas para avanzar hacia una verdadera reforma. Hemos escuchado diversos insumos en el primer panel y en este segundo queremos aterrizar más específicamente al tema de deuda. En este panel nos acompañan de manera presencial, está aquí Ayubán Gutiérrez Quintanilla, quien es miembro del Comité Técnico Asesor del Ministerio de Economía y Planificación de Cuba. Aquí también tenemos a May Buenaventura. Ella es de Asian Movement on Debt and Development, nuestra organización hermana. También tenemos de manera virtual a Theo Young, que él es, no sé si está ya conectado para que lo puedan poner en pantalla y también lo puedan ver. Él es de African Network and Forum on Debt and Development. Y también tenemos de manera virtual a Marina Zucker Márquez. Ella es de la Boston University, del Global Development Policy Center. Y aquí nuestra querida compañera Eva, del Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales del Ecuador. Bueno, sin más preámbulos, me gustaría iniciar con una primera pregunta para Ayubán. Muchas gracias por estar aquí. El rol de Cuba ha sido muy importante, sobre todo en el proceso hacia el FFD4, y particularmente en el tema de deuda. Han planteado diversas propuestas, pero un apoyo explícito a reformas progresistas. Entonces, me gustaría que nos comentes cuáles son esas propuestas, cuál es la lectura sobre los desafíos actuales para América Latina y el Caribe y qué oportunidades hay para avanzar en reformas.
Bueno, buenos días. Ante todo, agradecer a Latindadd por la invitación y por tener la oportunidad de intercambiar con un público aquí presente, que después del panel de por la mañana, realmente yo en lo personal estoy muy motivado al encuentro. Primero partir que vivimos en un contexto muy particular del desarrollo del capitalismo. Estamos presenciando uno de las crisis, al criterio nuestro, más dura que ha tenido el capitalismo en su desarrollo. No en el sentido de la crisis, vamos a decir, tradicional de superproducción, sino como modelo económico y social. Nosotros en este periodo vemos que hay un grupo de situaciones que se han dado que exigen de una visión diferente de la gobernanza a nivel mundial. Y eso se evidenció muy claramente en la Conferencia de Sevilla. Es decir, nosotros hemos apostado por la idea de tratar de adaptarnos a las circunstancias y avanzar lo que podamos avanzar. Y esa fue parte de nuestra posición en Sevilla. Sobre todo a partir de no retroceder en algunas cosas que para nosotros son vitales y que tratamos que en Sevilla no se retrocediera. Y todo lo que podamos avanzar, aunque sea pequeño, todo lo que se pudo avanzar, aunque fuera pequeño, asumirlo como un éxito, porque nos da la oportunidad de seguir luchando en estos temas a nivel internacional. Hicimos varias propuestas, pero nos centramos en una propuesta muy importante, que es el tema de la deuda, fundamentalmente, sobre todo porque nosotros creemos que hace falta un nuevo instrumento multilateral para enfocar y enfrentar el tema de la deuda. Trabajamos mucho en el G77 en China, fue un poco el espacio que en que se desarrolló nuestro trabajo y creo que se lograron algunas cosas, no solo en términos de deuda, sino también en temas de financiación. Por ejemplo, se logró que en el texto apareciera un grupo de menciones que para nosotros son centrales. Por ejemplo, el desarrollo como un derecho humano. De alguna manera quedó en el texto. También se logró conservar un grupo de elementos de acuerdos anteriores, como el de Addis Abeba, por ejemplo, y que eran las cosas que nosotros nos referíamos que no se debía retroceder en esos temas, y creo que se logró que no se retrocediera en estos aspectos. También hay menciones, se logró incluir algunas menciones al tema de las Naciones Unidas en la transformación de la gobernanza mundial en estos temas. Se habló también del tema del espacio de la política nacional en todos estos temas que se van de lo nacional, que son internacionales, pero donde no se puede abandonar las características de cada uno de los países que participan en este proceso, que son muy diversas y por lo tanto diferentes. También el tema de alinearlos con los planes de desarrollo de cada país, donde la deuda juega un papel fundamental. Y bueno, se hicieron también menciones al tema de la reforma del sistema financiero internacional, que para nosotros también es un tema central. Algo que también nos pareció importante es cómo conectar los temas de financiamiento y los temas de la deuda con otros acuerdos internacionales, como por ejemplo el de Río de Cambio Climático, que eso es un tema para nosotros central. En el caso de Cuba, casualmente mañana se presenta públicamente la política de transición energética del país, donde están presentes tanto los temas, están muy presentes los temas de financiamiento y que se conectan con el tema de la deuda también del país. Fue muy complejo el trabajo. Tenemos que decir que realmente los equipos nuestros que participaron en las negociaciones tuvieron que trabajar mucho, sobre todo por temas que aquí se ha mencionado, de lograr la unidad, sobre todo en los países latinoamericanos, pero en el G77 sobre todo, en dejar bien claro cuáles son los objetivos comunes que tenemos, cuáles son las metas que se emanan de esos objetivos y qué mecanismos vamos a usar en común para lograr esas metas. Y tratamos de centrarnos y ser extremadamente ambiciosos en las agendas mínimas que podíamos lograr, pero creo que se lograron algunas de las cosas que habíamos mencionado. Falta muchísimo y por eso vemos Sevilla como una oportunidad de seguir trabajando y avanzar en profundizar algunas de estas propuestas. Ahí específicamente nosotros nos centramos en lo que llamamos un proceso intergubernamental en el marco de las Naciones Unidas del trabajo de la deuda, ¿no? El enfrentamiento a la deuda. No se logró en Sevilla lo que queríamos, pero sí se dio un paso de avance, y es que se incluyó como una mención dentro del documento iniciar el proceso de este mecanismo, que nosotros lo vemos como una fortaleza, como algo que nos permite avanzar, sobre todo porque se dejó abierto de que pudiera entrar en los programas de discusión de las propias Naciones Unidas, es decir, a través de la discusión de determinadas resoluciones, etcétera, ¿no? Que podían obtenerse más adelante. Y creo que se logró también porque se participó en comunidad, en unión, varios países del sur, pero específicamente latinoamericanos que apoyaron, que trabajaron este tema con mucha fuerza. Un tema también que para nosotros es importante, en el caso cubano particularmente, es el tema de la no utilización de las medidas económicas y financieras coercitivas unilaterales, que fue un tema también que se presentó. Por ejemplo, un poco poniendo la experiencia de Cuba, nosotros a mediados de la década pasada hicimos una renegociación de la deuda bastante exitosa. Logramos alcanzar una renegociación bastante buena. Eso significó que pudimos estabilizar un poco el indicador del déficit en la balanza de pago, usarlo como un indicador de planificación económica y financiera. Pues sencillamente en otros momentos era imposible hacer una planificación con déficit en balanza de pagos muy grande. Eso se logró bajar ese déficit a partir de esta renovación de la deuda, pero en el segundo semestre del 2019 comienza a arreciar la guerra económica de Estados Unidos con la presidente Trump. Viene posteriormente la COVID, donde el país dedicó todos los recursos que tenía y reservas que tenía a proteger a su población. Fuimos un país fuimos los que tomamos la medida de encerrarnos, es decir, eso tiene un costo. Nosotros somos una isla con una economía insular, tuvo un costo importante para la economía del país, y en un periodo de 5 años también, y aquí está todo conectado, por eso no dejamos nunca mencionar ríos, nos pasaron 2 grandes ciclones por los 2 extremos del país. Hace un mes, en octubre, el segundo, que realmente creó destrozos inmensos en la región oriental del país. El anterior había sido en el occidente del país. Entonces, en esta situación, además de siempre nosotros tenemos que ser críticos con uno mismo, que es lo que no hemos hecho para, a partir de esas restricciones, hacerlo mejor, pero eso ha provocado, por supuesto, un incremento de la deuda, ¿no? De todos esos que habíamos hecho. Entonces, en ocasiones, nosotros podemos hacer instrumentos donde, producto de la negociación, logremos avanzar en los mecanismos de pago de deuda, pero situaciones de este tipo a las que somos tenemos una elasticidad muy grande los países pequeños como nosotros, y sobre todo de carácter insular. Y eso tiene que estar de alguna manera también desde Cuba. Insistimos mucho en que los mecanismos tienen que establecer esas diferencias. Tenemos que compartir las responsabilidades, pero también reconocer que hay diferencias entre los países. Y este es uno de los temas más complejos en las negociaciones. El tema de reconocer esas diferencias, y fue bastante complejo. Por último, nosotros reconocemos que tenemos que identificar objetivos comunes en la región, y para nosotros nos cuesta trabajo porque nuestro país tiene un sistema económico y social que, por supuesto, no siempre conecta con el mundo, pero tenemos que jugar como economía con esas reglas, y para nosotros lo más importante es que podamos avanzar juntos y no a partir de intereses económicos, políticos, ideológicos individuales, ¿no? Y eso es algo que siempre ha marcado nuestra diplomacia, en este caso, en estos temas. Y por último, bueno, insistir que es lo más importante para nosotros, que es lograr que quede oficializado, que sea un consenso y se acuerde este mecanismo multilateral para la negociación de la deuda soberana. Para nosotros es algo importante, porque se mencionó lo que ocurrió en los años 80 con la deuda, con las características diferentes que tenía América Latina. Coincide mucho con lo que decía el compañero de la CEPAL, pero también ahí pasó algo, y es que hubo una posición común muy fuerte de América Latina. Recuerdo que nosotros teníamos una frase, Fidel defendió una idea que era: la deuda externa es incobrable y es impagable. Eso desde el punto de vista de la lógica de las finanzas internacionales es un problema, porque estás dando una señal muy mala para el futuro, porque de todas maneras tienes que seguir endeudándote, no hay. Pero como instrumento político tuvo un efecto realmente positivo y unió a posiciones incluso de países que no coincidíamos ideológicamente. Y eso es algo que yo creo que es una línea que debemos seguir y por la cual está apostando el país de este trabajo en conjunto. Nosotros, sin ser extremadamente optimistas, sí tenemos el suficiente optimismo para seguir trabajando en la arena internacional en lo referente al tema de financiamiento y específicamente al tema de la deuda.
Muchas gracias, Ayuban.
Okay.
Well, thank you, May, for being here. We heard many things from Ayuban, important things from what they are proposing, what are their views. But I would like to ask you about the impacts of the public debt on people, on the environment. So I saw that APMDD is playing an important role in mobilizing, in raising awareness about these social impacts. So I would like to ask you, what's the situation regarding public debt in Asia? What are the impacts of this debt, and what are you proposing to getting out of this systemic crisis?
Okay, muchas gracias, especially to Latindadd for this opportunity and coming to Latin America, which is so far away. It's always such a delight because of the shared colonial histories, also the shared struggles from the time of the Jubilee, the first Jubilee. And I think while the terrain has changed, the fundamental, the basic analysis, I think, remains the same. We still speak of capitalism, and I was thinking earlier, when it was mentioned why there's so much accumulation of debt. And we have to think of capital not as a thing, but as a process, and it will not abide by limits. It will always find a way to innovate, because under capitalism, it hates any blockage to the flow of capital. So just to share a little bit on Asia, because we don't meet each other frequently face to face. So I prepared a few slides.
Por favor, la presentación, si me ayudan poniéndola.
I will not read through everything, but I just want to leave some data and many similarities, no? I think I'm also happy that I chose the title of my presentation as Choosing Life Over or Before Death, which is also aligned with el tema de Conferencia, no? And so this is a picture of the last march we had during the IMF and World Bank meetings, and these actions were held in different Asian countries. Yeah, I'll just say. Okay, so next slide. There's, of course, many markers why debt is such a critical matter for the present and the future of Asian peoples, no? Not only economically speaking, but also intergenerationally, what this means for our youth, what their future is, no? So I will just center on three. The debt servicing costs as a share of revenues, which I think was mentioned earlier. The SDG progress, the Sustainable Development Goals, progress or lack thereof, or stagnation, and of course the climate crisis. Next slide. So looking at debt servicing costs, you can see there that this has doubled, no? The external debt stock for Asia and Pacific from 2008 to 2023, and the Asian Development Bank reports a 145% increase. So in several regions, in several sub-regions, there are also differences. It's even worse among the Pacific nations, no? And only the low-income countries, with of course category of the World Bank, are deemed eligible for debt relief, but many of the Asian countries are of course middle income, and debt relief measures are not open to them. So a clear example of this misassessment or wrong reading is the case of Sri Lanka, which is a middle income country, but it was the first Asian country to default in this century. So it's not eligible for the common framework, or before that, the debt service suspension initiative. And the same also for Pakistan, which is on the verge also of falling into default. And of course, we know that borrowings are increasingly becoming expensive, with the debt serving costs already surpassing the last 3 years since the pre-2020 levels. So also differences across countries. I know that GDP, that debt to GDP is not a very good measure, but just just to get an idea of how these countries mentioned here have their debt to GDP ratios over 100 already. So next slide. And in terms of the SDG, next slide, please. So in terms of the SDG targets, I don't know how this looks like in Latin America, but there's a very clear assessment that in Asia, no single Asian country will be able to fulfill this fully by the time of the target, which is 2030. And of course, there's very bad consequences on social spending. So of what was mentioned earlier as 3.4 billion of the global, it's said that 83% of Asia developing country populations, or around 2.2 billion, live in governments that prioritize debt repayments over health, particularly health, and I mentioned the countries here. So it's either a stagnation, nothing's happening, or a regression, going back to delivering outcomes for the SDGs. So there's very critical SDGs here that countries are not fulfilling. For example, the SDG on hunger, the SDG on health, the SDG on climate action, and so on. So yeah, so for the next slide, climate and debt, the previous slide, please. So climate and debt, it's very clear how these are mutually reinforcing. And some of the most threatened countries of the climate crisis, which of course we did not cause as Global South, are also among the most debt distressed. So in 2023 alone, the estimated losses ran to 65 billion, and this is projected to increase further. And if we look at the global population that are at the coastal areas, 70% of these are in the Asia-Pacific region as well. So these are also estimated to require bigger and bigger amounts for survival. No? So for the next slide, we're showing here that, of course, the MDBs, the multilateral development banks, continue to report that, oh, we put so much funds into climate action. No? But if you look closely, much of that are in the form of loans. So for example, the one that's like the World Bank in our region, which is the Asian Development Bank, it reports this 10.5 billion in adaptation from 2019 to 2023, but only this much, 6%, was provided as grants, which is what we demand as a matter of justice, and even greater was, much greater, were provided as loans. So if you look at the graph here from the report, it's also very much privileging mitigation rather than adaptation, which is what the Global South really urgently needs, because we are in the front line of loss and damage and climate-induced catastrophes. So next slide. Next slide, please. Okay. Oh. Yeah, next slide. So another one is there's a continuing campaigning amongst the sister networks of the debt and development organizations on how the dominant debt frameworks are missing the mark. So you may know already of what's wrong with common framework for debt treatments. And it was sad that this continues to be pushed or continued to be pushed in the fourth Financing for Development Conference. And we already mentioned the case of Sri Lanka that is not covered by debt relief. It does not also, these frameworks also do not account for climate risk or inequalities within countries. Amongst the most severe, of course, are India, also in my own country, the Philippines, where there's really stark inequalities. And there's also a stagnation of public services, systems, and infrastructure, which is also a result of loan conditionalities of the privatization of essential services. And specifically with the common framework, there is no mechanism to require participation of all creditor classes. And this specifically refers to the private bondholders, which rose from $46 billion to $350 billion in 2023 for the Asia region. So there's so much exposure to the bondholders, and this is actually what happened to Sri Lanka when it could no longer meet the obligation. And of course, it has been, there's a court case because Sri Lanka, a government, is being sued by banks as if they were on equal footing. So, and of course, the MDBs are exempt, such as the World Bank. So this is, I think, my last slide, just moving on. So as a campaigning organization, we are, of course, looking to really escalating campaigning for the cancellation of unsustainable and illegitimate debts and an end to austerity and harmful loan conditions. No single country can really succeed in this endeavor. So I remember when our colleague from Cuba was speaking, the 2005 South-South convening in Cuba, and I really looked forward to, that strengthening that South-South unities and collaboration, because a united front, which also Tomas Sankara mentioned, in the fight against debt domination is really critical. Also, we need to look at movement building. So this is what we're also doing as the DADDs, also working with climate justice movements, also women's movements and the youth, and making the connections, because the issue of the burdensome debt really cuts across many of these social justice movements. And last one, but of course not the least, we really need to engage with national governments from regional, also and regional to global intergovernmental spaces. And I'm very glad that we also have here Andres Chiriboga, who we had a meeting here in Quito, no, on the borrowers platform, and I'm happy that Pakistan and Nepal have showed so much interest there in Washington, and we're also reaching out to Sri Lanka, also in connection with what benefits they could gain from supporting a UN Framework Convention on Sovereign Debt, and also engaging a borrowers forum. And of course, debt audits, which we see as really critical, and I'm also delighted that a colleague of Lucia Fotorelli is here, because we continue to use her work in our capacity building in Asian amongst our members on how to do debt audits, citizens and official debt audits, and of course, calling on our governments, our own governments, to repudiate harmful debts, because we do not absolve our governments, because they are also, to an important degree, they're also complicit in implementing the conditionalities, implementing austerity, and of course, contracting loans without our knowledge. And finally, to really advocate that we need a strong voice in a space where we have a say in the problem of illegitimate and unsustainable debts, which is not open to us in creditor-dominated spaces such as the IMFs and the World Bank. So that's also one of the, I think this was in Sevilla, where we also marched with this streamer. No? So we continue to stand by those calls. Pag ganyan, ano lang, la deuda, cambien la sistema. Because I think that's really at the crux of the matter, that the current system cannot hold. And to be able to transform it, we engaged in these spaces. Of course, in Sevilla, we were realistic enough to believe that the debt convention would take many years. But as civil society, we see those fronts as building blocks, as fronts that we open, beachheads that we establish towards more strategic, durable, and long-lasting goals for debt justice. So thank you. So yeah, so if you need more information, you can just scan the QR code. Thank you.
Thank you so much, May. Me quedo con también el mensaje de unidad, cooperación, colaboración sur-sur. Creo que es momento también de sumar esfuerzos hacia un fin común. And I will now turn to Theo. He is online. Hi, Theo. Thank you for being with us today. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, but very faintly.
Now you can hear me better.
That's better. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you again. I have two questions for you. Africa is one of the regions with the greatest debt and financing difficulties. So as a similar question that I asked to May, what are the experiences in African countries regarding debt impacts? You have many countries that have gone through the common framework, so perhaps you have some assessment after the debt restructurings. And the second question is, Africa and the African Union have played an important role in the different international spaces. But I will focus on the African Union's Lomé Declaration that followed the debt conference in May this year. And what can you tell us about the African position? What are the points of agreement with civil society demands? And the scope for progress towards a reform for Africa and for the global South? Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm very delighted to join this meeting with our partner, Latindadd, and also to extend my apologies for not being able to be at this conference in person due to some logistic challenges that actually Afro stands in solidarity with the Dadd, especially Latindadd, and of course their shared experiences that gets across the regions, the experiences in Asia, as well as the experiences in Africa, and of course we just had May from the experiences in in Asia. You know, all of this cut across. And when you look at the system of indebtedness in the broader sense, it is an instrument of extraction, an instrument of subjugation, of course, a neo-colonial design. And the issues, when you look at the issues, they are not very difficult to resolve, but the main challenge is actually being able to balance the complex interest around these issues, to deal with issues around the self-preservation, balancing that self-preservation and the political will to bring about the solutions that can address these concerns, these debt burdens faced by African countries. And this has been expressed in the form of denial in most instances, and in the form of blocking processes, and also in the brazen lack of political will, to find solutions. And this is just also how the systems were instituted from the start before we got to this point. The continuation of the legacies of colonialism and slavery and slave trade. And a lot of it, what we hear today, is actually just paying lip service to development. And when you look at the G20 that just ended in South Africa, you begin to see, that brazen lack of political will around these issues. And then we begin to ask ourselves, why did, the G20 even come to Africa this year? If critical issues like the G20 Common Framework that you mentioned, if these critical issues are not picked up, in these G20 processes, and the kind of reforms that should bring about structural changes that will help countries break out of this recurrent cycle of indebtedness in which countries have been stuck for decades, becomes a very concerning question. So in terms of the impact of all of this in African countries, I think a lot of it can be understood, not just in the points, but also in the figures when you look at issues of around how debt servicing, is crowding out social spending in African countries. And I think at the average today, it's about 45% of government revenue that goes into debt service at the expense of providing health sector spending, at the expense of education, social protection, and of course, investment in infrastructure. And when you look at the case, a country like Ghana, which is one of the countries that signed up for the common framework, you see that this country actually was spending up to 50% of their tax revenues on interest payments, before signing up for the common framework. And part of it, signing into coming up for the common framework, I also seen the country experience some severe depreciation in its currency, reduced physical space due to some of the conditionalities that are associated with this G20 process. And we've seen also the issues around a freeze in public service hiring and cuts in capital spending in a country like that. And this brings us to issues of austerity in these countries. For instance, a country like Kenya, that has been under repeated IMF-supported programs, have seen unrest just recently, if you followed this 2023 to 2024. And this is an expression of that pinch, with these austerity policies stemming out of the G20 common framework process. And you also see what I'm trying to describe here, the same kind of pressures in countries like Zambia. We have heard the same for countries like Ethiopia that has also signed up for the common framework, where you see issues of austerity creeping in this country. So, and part of the impact of the system of indebtedness, it's also as a result of the unfair credit ratings practices that increase borrowing costs for African countries. I think African countries it's one of the highest regions where the cost of capital, of accessing capital, is at its highest compared to maybe just about 1 or 2% or even lower for countries in the West, like maybe the United States of America and Germany. And it becomes concerning how the countries that are in need and who are in a position where they, they need the capital most, right? How this capital is becoming even expensive despite the needs, you know, and the fiscal gaps that needs to be plugged, you know, for countries to be able to be on track when it comes to implementing their the social contract. Of course, this is about development. It's about citizen welfare in many African countries. And again, going back to the G20 common framework, you will see how slow it has been for countries like Zambia, despite, you know, the austerity policies that are associated with the G20 common framework. You know, the country took nearly 3 years just to agree, you know, on the debt terms. And the delays caused a lot of rising poverty, you know, fiscal paralysis, investor uncertainty, you know. I mean, and then in a country like Ethiopia, as I mentioned earlier, it entered the G20 common framework in 2021 amidst conflict, and there has not been much progress, you know, ever since. You know, of course, this is a country that is faced with the humanitarian crisis and reconstruction needs, maybe from the conflict that, I mean, is in the country. And the inability of the common framework to resolve the fiscal concerns in this country, you know, is a clear failure, you know, of this suggestion. Of course, we have heard instances where people talk about reforming the system or expediting it, but this will remain grossly insufficient because you all know we have had ambitious packages, as ambitious as the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative and the MDRI, but this did not solve the problem. It was just pushed the problem down the road, right? Which means we need comprehensive reforms, you know, for countries to break free from this system, from this, you know, recurrence of experiences of heavy debt burdens that constrain the fiscal space that countries need to be able to develop. And it is a systemic issue in the fact that debt itself is not independent of other aspects like illicit financial flows. Like Mozambique, you know, during cyclones Idai, you know, caused damages of up to 3 billion in Mozambique, right? These are the effects of climate. But how do these countries reconstruct, you know, with the huge financial burdens that they carry? And countries who are in this position because of climate events, which, of course, they are not at the origin of it. We know where the most fossil fuels, you know, that causes this climate change, where it's coming from. So, so there is a lot that could be said in terms of how this indebtedness, how it's impacting on African countries. And like you also asked about the Lome Declaration expressing the aspiration of African countries. Of course, this was one of part of what forms the common African position, you know, for the reform of the global financial architecture, you know, part of the common African position on debt. And you could see that some of the aspects from here were the need for a new debt resolution mechanism Of course, there was quite a lot around talking about the common framework, about reforming the common framework, pushing for fiscal and systemic reforms, um, improving credit ratings, and focusing on issues of debt management and accountability. Of course, these are true, but one thing that remains critical, remains critical is moving beyond just the solutions, right? Towards what it, we have in the Lome Declaration, the call for a UN Framework Convention on Debt, of course, which has been reduced to a multilateral process in the civil outcome document. When you look at what we have in section 50F of this document, which actually recommends that there is a need for a radical shift from the status quo towards processes that will help countries, address the structural weaknesses in their economy that, and of course within the global financial system that sits at the heart of the recurrent indebtedness. And of course, what do we as civil
Theo,
society need to
apologies,
do?
you have 1 minute, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I was just saying in terms of we as civil society, what we have to do, in this process. I think the need to build coalitions remains critical. Of course, issues of challenging the status quo are very important, but what also remains is that coordinated effort to bring about the structural solutions that can help countries break out of these recurrent cycles. And of course, I'm looking at the UN-led multilateral sovereign debt workout mechanism, and this requires coordination among civil society, for us to be able to bring about the aspirations expressed in the Lome Declaration and in what we call the Common African Position on Debt. And all of this also borders on overhauling or reforming entire global financial system in ways that will enable countries break out of this recurrent cycles of indebtedness. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. And now, in the interest of time, I will turn to Marina. I don't know if Marina can hear me.
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you, Marina, for joining this panel. Well, I'm going right away to the, to the question. We heard some experiences and impacts of the debt in Asia, in Africa, in the Global South in general. And I would like now to turn the question and to ask you, what about the Global North debt? And I think it's important to discuss the asymmetries in the treatment of debt between the North and the South. And for instance, the high indebtedness in the most advanced economies is approached from a different perspective. No austerity is imposed, or for instance, they are not assessed as more risky. So how does that debt of the Global North impact economies in the Global South? But at the same time, how does this situation help us to understand the need for an independent arbiter in terms of debt? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank Latindadd for the invitation and also congratulate you for the 5th anniversary. So this is very exciting. And so more than ever, I think it's really important groups like the Latindadd, all the Dadd family, and many researchers and advocacy groups. It's really time to be having this discussion on not only on that, but broadly, what is a just economic system? And to answer this question, I think this is important to give a step back and understand a little bit what is behind the systemic problem, right? Because this panel we are discussing what is the systemic problems, what are the systemic solutions, and I think sometimes we take for granted what are the sources of the problem, And for many, and for international organizations, for people in the global north, usually the problem of the debt in the global south is usually a matter of corruption or macroeconomic mismanagement. There is no such problem in the global north, but in the global south, that is usually a domestic problem. And I'm now in the group, the Jubilee. I had the pleasure to be part of the Jubilee report, coordinated by Professor Stiglitz with the Columbia University and the Vatican. And something that we discuss is that actually it's a problem of the system of the international financial architecture. And I always say that it's the Jubilee year. If we just switch all the global south bureaucracy, from like people that work in the government, and we just switch for angels from God, we're still going to have a lot of problems on sovereign debt, because the problem they're global source. So what are they? In the report, we discuss a bit on the cyclicality of global finance. So this is something that very famous economists highlight. Helen Ray, Professor Stiglitz are one of them. So basically, and Professor Ocampo always says, so basically, one that is low interest rate on developed countries, there is a lot of inflows from developed countries to developing. Usually, some of these flows are productive, which is good during low interest rate, but a lot of this is speculative flows. And for many years, there was a pressure for international financial, organizations that developing countries should liberalize capital flows, making foreign exchange flexible, and this leads to a foreign exchange rate appreciation in developing countries, which then harm the productive capacity of developing countries, less space for actually export, and this means less inflows of dollars through exports, which is a very important source. But then when the cycle reverses, when there are inflations in developed countries and for any reason they need to increase the interest rate in the global north, what happens is that investors look for safety and they repatriate funds from developing countries to developed. And this is usually when the crisis comes. And usually the crisis not from the developing countries is basically shock in the developed countries, or external shocks at COVID. So this was during COVID, during 2008. So it's external shocks, and it's an external dynamic that are actually shaping the debt problem in developing countries. And one may say, okay, so this is just a problem of refinancing, right? Because when you need finance, developing countries are not reaching this finance because markets don't want to lend. That's just partially true, and that's why there was this, the constructions of what we call the global financial safety net. That is basically the IMF, regional financial arrangements, swaps, and this network would actually be thought to help developing countries when markets do not want to, borrow, do not lend to developing countries. The problem is that the global financial safety net is very flawed. First, we did a bunch of research on this. Not like very good sources of finance, like swaps from the Fed. They just reach rich countries, Europe, Japan, Switzerland. Usually, there are like important gaps. So Africa doesn't have a regional financial arrangement of its own. It has approved, but there is no fund on the African Regional Fund. And of course, countries can go to the IMF, but the IMF comes with a lot of conditionalities. Usually, we don't see the promise for growth and actually long-term, solving the vulnerability as it should. So countries don't want to go to the IMF, and we understand why. So actually, the structure global financial safety net that would, help during like inflows and outflows during crisis doesn't actually work. And so developing countries are in a situation where we know that there is this structure problem, but the structure that was supposed to help you doesn't help. And we have more and more crises, right? Frequent crises. So it's basically a situation where developing countries need, to build development, let's say build, you can compare the analogy for like when you have earthquakes, right? If you're a country that you need to build a city, but every so in a while there is an earthquake, it's really hard for you to actually develop. So I think we need to understand, and why I'm putting this here, because the question that was made was on the global south, the global north debt. The question is, the global north has a lot of possibility to refinancing their position, right? So if there is a crisis, they have higher capacity to actually have fiscal spending. The interest rate is often much lower. So I was just reading the news this morning that Angola is refinancing their position there in the Eurobond markets with 9%, and they were celebrating that it was just 9%. So this is very expensive, right? And if you're Europe, if you're Germany, the US, you're going to refinance your position for like maximum 3-4%. So the access to markets and access to refinancing is really bad. It's really better. So actually, if developing countries have access to this cost of finance as cheap as developed, we wouldn't be facing this situation. If developing countries have access to the global financial safety net that is as good as global north has, we would also not having this problem of pushing the austerity domestically. So a lot of the problems, this is the structural framing that we need to be aware of. What we have been highlighting in our research is that in this situation, there is no, even if you say it's the liquidity problem, we hear this much, frequent. We're actually not a solvency problem, we're a liquidity problem. It's not a systemic crisis, it's just, crisis in specific countries. But even if that's the case, if you don't have a global financial safety that works, there is no solution but to, stop paying, restructure. But then we go to the politics of that restructuring currently, which is very complicated. I won't repeat. A lot of people talked about the common framework and how, the fact that so many countries are facing that distress, but just 4 countries actually applied to the common framework. I think this is a sign that it's actually not working. So I just want to wrap up brainstorming a little bit what could be done going forward. I think first it's very important to understand these asymmetries, and that's why that in the global south is so different from that in the global north. But by understanding this, so what can we do? Like some very concrete approaches going forward. Of course, I think this reforming the common framework is going to be very difficult, especially because next year the G20 is going to be in the US, and I will be very surprised if we have, advancements on that, apart from maybe an attempt to weaponize the discussion on that, given the geopolitical situation. But we need to be talking about more ways to encourage countries to restructure, because at the current stage, we are just punished. If you need to restructure your debt, you're just punished. Governments are not reelected. Domestically, you spend 3-4 years in a limbo, which is not good. So we need a structure that actually allowed countries to, in a human way, to restructure. So we need to be talking about that suspension when countries apply to restructuring. In the Jubilee report, we made it very clear that it's time to start discussing HIPC 2.0. Now we have a lot of inflexible debt. It means that from the World Bank, from IMF, which are supposed not able to restructure, but like when you have 90, 80, 75% of your debt with these creditors and you are in that distress, there is no way to run, you need to restructure with them. So we need to be talking about a HIPC 2.0. I think we need to be better in naming the HIPC. No country likes to be called high indebted poor countries, so I think we need to be better with the naming. We are suggesting now HOPE initiative, where a high opportunity prosperity enhancement, would be call it, but we need something that actually encourage countries to restructure. We need to be talking about the IMF goal. I think a lot of countries don't want to, developed countries, they say, we don't have any money, we cannot spend now, we have to spend on like defense, which, for some countries is the valid spending, but, that is a space for them to spend on development as well. And they say, we don't have money. I'm telling you, that is a lot of money in the IMF. So, and in next years, a lot of countries are going to pay back to IMF. So why not to just sell a very small portion of IMF code to give some breathing space to the most poor? So we need to be talking about it. It's something that is going to cost zero to the taxpayers. So why not to talk about it? We also need to talk about more debt. And this can sound contradictory, but I think there are different types of debt. There are good debt and there are bad debt. We need to reduce the bad ones that are very expensive, very volatile, short maturities, and we need more debt that is productive. And this means more debt from multilateral development banks, more, investments, and this is going to mobilize, growth, which is going to enhance the probability of you paying the debt back. And of course, we need more exports from the global south. So to enable countries to pay back their external debt, these countries need to export more. So I think that is a combination of all factors. That is no, magic solution, but we need a debt restructuring for many countries, combined with more exports and more investments. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Marina, and thank you also for respecting the time. Creo que hemos escuchado bastantes insumos, también de parte de Marina y algunas cosas como deuda buena y mala que también salió hoy con Esteban de CEPAL. Pero también el tema de promover reestructuraciones más tempranas creo que es difícil con un sistema tal como está hoy. Y más bien lo que están surgiendo son propuestas o soluciones, digamos, que tratan de abordar de manera parcial la liquidez. Y entre ellas lo que más ha ganado espacio en todos los debates es el tema de los canjes de deuda. Y aquí tenemos el caso justamente de Ecuador, un caso reciente que muestra todas las falencias de estos instrumentos para abordar una crisis de la magnitud que enfrentamos países del sur en general. Entonces, bueno, Eva, quisiera que nos compartas, por favor, un poco sobre la experiencia, obviamente, del canje de Ecuador. Pero no es el canje de Ecuador fue canje de deuda por naturaleza, pero también están surgiendo iniciativas sobre otros canjes relacionados a salud, educación, incluso seguridad alimentaria. Nada, ¿cuáles son las principales preocupaciones? ¿Qué recomendaciones plantean desde la experiencia del Ecuador? Y si más bien esto podría ser un elemento más distractivo de discutir las reformas estructurales.
Bueno, buenas tardes ya con todas y con todos. Sí, desde mi organización, el Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales CEDES, hemos venido estudiando desde algún tiempo ya estos instrumentos financieros que están ahora de moda, ¿no? Porque recordemos que sí, los países del sur global estamos atravesando una doble crisis, una crisis de deuda y una crisis de los efectos del cambio climático. Desde ese sentido, en el Ecuador se realizó un canje de deuda en el año 2023, pero para irnos más a fondo de los canjes de deuda por naturaleza, primero tenemos que contestar esta pregunta, ¿no? ¿Qué son los canjes de deuda por naturaleza? Pues los canjes de deuda por naturaleza son mecanismos financieros que convierten parte de la deuda de los estados en pagos para conservación ambiental. Ahora los dicen como instrumentos novedosos, ¿no? Pero debemos recordar que surgen en los años 80 y 90 como canjes de deuda bilaterales que tenía, por ejemplo, el Ecuador con Italia, Alemania, etcétera, pero eran por montos mucho menores que los que se están haciendo ahora. Los de ahora incluyen bonos temáticos, garantías del BID y fideicomisos privados. Y se presentan, como les decía, una doble crisis, la deuda de deuda y la climática, pero en el estudio y bajo la experiencia del Ecuador vemos que no están solucionando ninguna de estas dos crisis. ¿Cómo se realizó el canje de deuda en Galápagos del año 2023? Es que se canjearon 1.628 millones de bonos que surgieron de la reestructuración que se hizo del Ecuador en el año 2020. Recordemos que esta reestructuración se la hizo en el gobierno de Guillermo Lasso por el ex ministro de Economía y Finanzas, Richard Martínez. Entonces se crea un nuevo fondo, un nuevo préstamo de bono azul por 656 millones con pago al año 2041. Se crea el GPS Blue Financing DAG y con garantías del BID y de la DFC, todo esto orquestado por el Banco Credit Suisse. ¿Por qué son importantes las garantías del BID y el seguro de riesgo político de la DFC? La garantía del BID luego nos permite poner un reclamo ante el mecanismo de consulta e investigación MISI del BID. Recordemos también, y este dato es importante, que entre los años 22 y 23 el riesgo país del Ecuador estuvo en números altísimos, pero justo se da la muerte cruzada que destituye a Guillermo Lasso. En ese punto el riesgo país estaba altísimo. Adicionalmente y paralelamente, bueno, se crea el Galápagos Life Fund, que es este ente privado para administrar y ejecutar los recursos del canje de deuda. Acá podemos ver, por ejemplo, como les mencionaba, la reestructuración, se hicieron bonos para el 2030, 2035 y 2040 con un valor total de alrededor de 15.500 millones de dólares. El canje de deuda, como les decía, es por 1.628 millones, una parte de estos 3 bonos. Y como el riesgo país estaba súper alto, estos bonos se bajan a un valor, por ejemplo, el del 2030 a 53.5 centavos de dólar, el del 2035 a 38.5 centavos del dólar y el del 2040 a 35.5 centavos de dólar. Esto nos da el valor del nuevo préstamo de 656 millones de dólares, ¿no? O sea, decir que hubo un canje de deuda, porque al principio nos decían que el valor neto del ahorro fue de 1.628 millones de dólares, pero se crea un nuevo préstamo y el ahorro, según datos ya del Ministerio de Economía y Finanzas, del ahorro es de 972 millones de dólares, lo que nos deja una deuda de 13.900 en bonos soberanos. Ahora, las preocupaciones que ya nos vienen a nosotros a nivel de endeudamiento, por ejemplo, es que en el 2023 la deuda externa del Ecuador rondaba los 48 millones de dólares, la de bonos en 15.500. La reducción neta del canje, como les dije, de 972 millones, representa al menos el 2% de la deuda externa total y el 6% de la deuda en bonos, que es mínimo, ¿no? Aparte, no se han tomado en cuenta ni se han podido transparentar los gastos de asesores administrativos, por ejemplo, incluyendo gastos de asesores legales, etcétera. Y, por ejemplo, aquí tenemos un dato importante. En el canje de Bélice, que fue de 3 veces menor por el de Galápagos, los costos de administrativos, de asesoría legal, etcétera, ascienden a 86 millones de dólares. Solo gastos administrativos, en un canje 3 veces menor al de Ecuador. Y la comisión que cobró de Natural Conservancy, un asesor que también participó en el canje de deuda del Ecuador, fue de 14 millones. Es decir, creo que ya no serían solo 972 millones si tomamos en cuenta estos gastos administrativos. Y este dato también, por ejemplo, la deuda externa actual del Ecuador al año 2024 es de alrededor de 49.000 millones y la deuda actual en bonos soberanos es de 14.200 millones. Es decir, ya estamos en números iguales o más altos a cuando se hizo el canje de deuda. Es decir, aquí se desmonta el mito que dice que los canjes de deuda vienen a solucionar los problemas de endeudamiento. Acá, bueno, podemos ver algo un poco más gráfico. Ese es el valor que dice que es el Ministerio de Finanzas, tomando en cuenta que no se están tomando los gastos administrativos ni de asesoría legal, ¿no? La deuda en bonos, la deuda externa y, bueno, y la deuda pública, 80.000 millones, que eso sí ya, para que vean el monto y la magnitud de que no están resolviendo el problema de endeudamiento, ¿no? Otro tema que también nos surge de los canjes de deuda es el tema de transparencia, participación y soberanía. Porque en primer lugar no se conocen todos los gastos financieros. Como sedes nosotros solicitamos información al Ministerio de Ambiente, al Ministerio de Finanzas, incluso se hizo una acción de acceso a la información pública donde no fueron respondidas estas consultas. También otro tema importante es que, por ejemplo, que las comunidades de Galápagos no fueron consultados, nunca fueron consultados sobre si querían un canje de deuda, ¿no? Ni siquiera participaron en el diseño, ni tampoco en la gobernanza inicial del Galápagos Life Fund. Aquí recordemos que el artículo 398 de nuestra Constitución obliga a hacer una consulta ambiental en temas y a la comunidad en temas que los afecten directamente, ¿no? Todos estos temas, la falta de información, la falta de transparencia, la falta de consulta, nos habilitó a poner una queja ante el Mecanismo Independiente de Consulta e Investigación, el MISI del BID, que le presentamos organizaciones de la sociedad civil conjuntamente con comunidades del archipiélago de Galápagos. Aquí es importante mencionar que para que la queja ante el MISI sea admitida, tenían que ver que una comunidad se sienta directamente afectada por las actividades del BID. En este caso, el BID puso la garantía para el canje de deuda, entonces eso nos habilitó a poner la queja. Y tampoco habían sido consultados. Aparte de eso, tampoco se tuvo que demostrar que el BID había incumplido con su política operativa 102, que es de acceso a la información. Otro tema importante también es que el MISI, si bien aceptó la queja para tratar temas únicamente de transparencia, participación y acceso a la información, pero se declararon incompetentes para tratar el tema del canje de deuda y su uso como instrumento financiero. Entonces, el MISI no trató este tema. ¿Qué se logró en el mecanismo? En el MISI se incorporó un observador comunitario que va a entrar a la junta del GLF. También se cambió a una ONG extranjera por una ONG local en el directorio del GLF. Se acordó destinar alrededor del 18% de los recursos de organizaciones y proyectos locales y comunitarios. Y bueno, se reconocieron avances en transparencia y participación. El GLF ya tiene que publicar sus informes, tener actualizada su página, etcétera. Pero podríamos decir que se lograron avances en temas de participación y acceso a la información, pero de vuelta, el tema de los costos, el tema del endeudamiento, sigue, ¿no? La estructura del canje de deuda sigue intacta. También tenemos preocupaciones en el ámbito legal. Los contratos del canje de deuda vienen con arbitraje internacional privado como mecanismo de solución de controversias, pese a las restricciones constitucionales que tenemos en el Ecuador. Y recordemos que esto se nos volvió a preguntar en una consulta popular y el Ecuador volvió a decir que no, es decir, los arbitrajes internacionales están prohibidos en el Ecuador. Y los canjes de deuda tienen como mecanismo de solución de controversia arbitraje internacional. También hay cláusulas profundamente lesivas, por ejemplo, como el event of default, que es en caso de incumplimientos ambientales. En caso si el Ecuador sigue cumpliendo con sus pagos financieros, tiene que pagar la deuda. Y aquí recordemos de nuevo que el que tiene que cumplir con los compromisos ambientales es el Galápagos Life Fund, no es el Estado ecuatoriano. Es decir, si el Galápagos Life Fund llega a incumplir, el que tiene que pagar es el Estado ecuatoriano. Ese tipo de contradicciones, ¿no? También tenemos esta cláusula de pago acelerado que permiten exigir un pago inmediato de todo el capital e intereses ante cualquier supuesto de incumplimiento. Es decir, tenemos cláusulas profundamente lesivas y restrictivas y que la Procuraduría General del Estado advirtió de estos problemas, pero aún así se siguió, ¿no? con la firma del contrato de canje de deuda. Otros temas que también es que se crean estructuras paralelas como el GLF o el Amazon Conservation Dadd, porque aquí en el Ecuador ya vamos por el segundo canje de deuda, que se hizo por la Amazonía, y aquí recalcar que tampoco se hizo una consulta previa, libre e informada, porque ahí viven, obviamente, en la Amazonía habitan poblaciones indígenas, ahí que había una consulta previa, libre e informada. Los territorios y áreas protegidas se usan como garantías de operaciones financieras sin consulta. Se refuerzan relaciones coloniales, se exige conservación sin reconocer plenamente el derecho a decidir sobre reglas, riesgos y beneficios hacia las comunidades. Y finalmente, después de esto, ¿qué proponemos? Bueno, desde sedes y conjuntamente con Latindadd, obviamente, impulsamos la creación de una convención marco en el ámbito de Naciones Unidas sobre deuda soberana y auditorías integrales a estos contratos. Recordemos que en el Ecuador se hizo una auditoría a la deuda en el año 2008 y se pudieron determinar cláusulas lesivas, contratos ilegales, etcétera. Entonces, urge en el Ecuador una nueva auditoría, ¿no? Garantizar la consulta para las poblaciones directamente afectadas de estos contratos no se hacen. Y finalmente también es necesario que estos contratos, como lo determina en la Constitución, tanto nuevos convenios con el FMI, contratos de canjes de deuda por naturaleza, pasen por la aprobación de la Asamblea Nacional, que eso no se está haciendo, se está pasando por alto el Poder Legislativo. Entonces, eso por mi parte, muchas gracias.